Well, it's always hard to talk about Kant, I know, and I feel I didn't do terribly well the last time. You probably feel I'm trying to see how painful I can make it all. Actually, there's something in that, because I think if it's not hurting, it's just like a lot of other things, like training for the mile or something. It's not doing any good. So it should hurt some, but not to the point where you're unable to bear it, because I feel is overdoing it at that time. Now today I want eventually to get on to saying some things about the idea of the original contract as an idea of reason, and try to convey what that means and how that affects and makes a difference between Kant's view, a radical difference actually, a very big difference between Kant's view, if we say it's a contact doctrine at all, and Rawls. And so I hope to get to that. But I think before I get on to that, I probably should say some things about why the procedure I was going over the other day, which I called the CI procedure, which, recall, is a procedure for applying the moral law. The moral law I take to be an idea of reason. And since we feel the moral law is a constraint, there is a categorical imperative that says to follow the moral law. And we can think of it that way. Or it's a command of some kind, because we experience the moral law as a principle of a constraint. And then the problem is how to interpret that command. How do we apply it to the conditions of human life? And so we get the third thing introduced, which is this a procedure. But you ought to ask then why that is described as a categorical imperative, and what's the point of the contrast between it and hypothetical imperative. So I'll begin with some remarks about this in terms of the nature of the CI procedure itself. So the idea is it ought to be displayed in the steps that we go through of the procedure, why it's categorical. So you recall that the hypothetical imperative, if we say the hypothetical imperative, the way I want to interpret that is just the various principles and criteria whereby one would ascertain whether the agent's maxim at step one is rational or not, and presume that we are able to tell somehow if it's sincere, or it isn't clear how we do that, but that I'll leave aside. But how do we tell if it's rational? Well, we might tell in terms of things like given the agent's desires and aims, given what the agent is hoping to accomplish in the agent's life or something like that, is this a rational maxim for the agent to have? Meaning, does it characterize a policy that is calculated, given the agent's circumstances, to realize the agent's ends and desires in an effective way? Now, we might have criteria like to take effective means to your end. Also, a criterion like other things equal, to prefer the alternative which is a more likely or more probable to be successful, and things of that kind, others that we might list. But rather than going into details, we just suppose there are a number of principles of that sort in which, in terms of which we would judge the rationality of the agent's maxim. So that one might call the hypothetical imperative. It's just a name that I'm introducing. This is not terminology, but I think it's perfectly coherent with it, consistent with it, and not altering, I don't think, in any fundamental way. So then a particular maxim say I am to eat certain kinds of foods in order to train for the marathon or something, or whatever it is, we might say it's a particular maxim, the very specific kind that might be said to be rational, given that end, as decided by those other tests, and that is a hypothetical imperative. So there would be lots of hypothetical imperatives. Now the point of all of them is, in Kant's view, that they depend for their rationality on what the particular aims and interests and desires and ends of the agent are in a particular case. So there's no, so to speak, independent test of the rationality of the particular maxim apart from the particular desires that emerge has. So much then for the hypothetical imperative. So again, we can make the same kind of a distinction at the level of the categorical imperative. I think the categorical imperative is the DCI procedure. Well, that isn't quite correct. The way for applying the categorical imperative is the SCI procedure. Then if the particular categorical imperative, if we want to use that language, is a maxim that, or is generated by a maxim that passes the test of the CI procedure. So the precept to help others in need and to give them assistance when they need it, something of that kind, would be a moral precept that would pass the test, and they could say it is a particular categorical imperative. Again, this isn't strictly Kant's distinction, but at least I hope it doesn't alter it in any fundamental way. It's designed to make it clearer. So what's the point then of the term categorical, and what makes it so? The thing that I think is important to see that on Kant's view, we cannot act on a maxim which appears at the first step unless the maxim passes the CI procedure, unless it's acceptable. So if I plan to do an action and if I put it through this test and it is rejected, then on Kant's view I must formulate another maxim and act according to this other maxim before I can do what I had intended to do. Now, in some cases that might require me to repress altogether the kind of desire that prompted me to formulate this maxim. But in other occasions it might not be as drastic as that. It might just require me to alter my action in some way, to adjust or to tailor my desire in some fashion. So rather than repressing it, to revise my wants and require me to do something else. But I might be able to do more or less the same thing by the use of some other and different means. But the point that ought to be emphasized is that the agent, as I'm interpreting Kant to describe the agent's deliberations, can never at any point in this process say, well, I want to do, or I want to achieve this particular end very much. It means a lot to me. And therefore, that's enough to entitle me to override the requirements of the categorical imperative and to do it anyway. The agent cannot balance in terms of the intensity of the agent's desires, cannot use that intensity to counterbalance it, outweigh the requirements of the moral law. And that's one way in which one can describe the moral law as a categorical. it subordinates, if we think the language is, I think, somewhat briefer and therefore perhaps easier, something of a shorthand. If we think of the hypothetical imperative and with the desires that prompt particular hypothetical imperatives, if we call that the rational, and we think of the categorical imperative as expressing for us the requirements of the moral law as the reasonable, then we can say on Kant's view that the reasonable has priority over the rational and subordinates it absolutely. And that language, reasonable and rational, comes from what I think is a natural English usage, where we might sometimes say, well, we're dealing with someone who's pressing us hard in some situation, and we might say, well, their proposal from their point of view, I understand, I can see it, perfectly rational from their point of view, but nevertheless they're being very unreasonable, and that means they're pushing a hard bargain and taking advantage of their, say, accidental or what seems to us unfair position of superiority. Rational from that standpoint, but not reasonable. I think that's an understandable distinction. So that's all. Although if we did want to use the full terminology, what we could say that the categorical imperative is prior to the hypothetical imperative and subordinates its requirements absolutely. The absolutely is absolute. They can never be overridden. Now, I don't believe, as a way of a comment, that Kant's categorical imperative a procedure, if we think of it as a procedure, is not going to be very useful in actually telling us what the correct, say, precepts or principles of morality are. So I don't think that that is the valuable element in it, although there have been attempts, and one has to do a lot along those lines, to see how far one can actually develop the content of, we might say, of our moral views from this procedure. And that's an interesting thing to do, but I shan't attempt to do it here. The thing I'm concerned with is to make these sort of general distinctions and to ask you to focus on, to get some picture of this general structure of how this procedure goes. And to see that what's going on in it is, at least the way I like to think of it, is the subordination of the rational to the reasonable, or the subordination of this notion of our quest for some fulfillment of our overall desires, that's being restricted by some prior principle that in Kant's view he calls moral law, and he thinks of that law as an idea of reason, an idea of pure reason. Or in his language we could, well, perhaps I will not introduce more terminology. These things all come to the same, and perhaps confusing. The contrast that you ought to bear in mind here, and I'll mention this and pass on to another point, is with utilitarianism. Now, I have to characterize in the text, in CJ, I think this is the preferable way from my standpoint to characterize it, although it is a standard, to characterize the utilitarian view as defining some notion of the good independently from a notion of the right, where we have, presumably I'm regarding the notion of the right as an intuitive distinction that we're able to make, and we know what that means enough for our purposes. So it defines the good independently from the right, and then gives a particular characterization of the good as the satisfaction of desires, or it characterizes the good hedonistically as pleasure, or maybe as the satisfaction of rational desires, where, again, I'm understanding the term rational as I have in the case of hypothetical imperatives. Without any moral elements in it. And then the right is then to maximize that good. Put it in terms of institutions as to arrange institutions so that from now on and in general, taking the facts of the world into account and desires as they exist, to arrange social institutions so that they maximize the good. So on that view, if you condemn certain desires, if you punish them, and so on, you do so because if you don't repress them, they're prompting people to act on them will have bad consequences. So that Bentham will say that the pleasure of the criminal, say in some violent act of hurting someone, is just as valuable as any other pleasure. It is to be measured in terms of its intensity and duration, just the same as what we ordinarily think of as innocent pleasures. But we can't encourage people to have desires of that kind and to act on them. Indeed, we want to discourage them as far as we can because they have unfortunate consequences. So although the pleasure itself has an intrinsic value as pleasure on Bentham's view, at least how it's often described, the mystic view, it has counterbalancing effects on average, so it becomes very bad in the aggregate, and so therefore we repress it. So on that view, you try to account for certain desires being repressed in terms of these effects. And how far that enters in any case of a conscious CI procedure is it may be a question that we can dispute, but often if we look at it and take it through this test, one will never balance from the agent standpoint the agent's intensity of desires or their urgency. That will not enter in. So what one will get on Kant's view on the interpretation of what I suggested is that there are certain ends that are permissible ends, and those will be ends that can be pursued in accordance with the CI procedure, or more accurately, those will be ends that are prompted by maxims that will get through the CI procedure. And if ends are not of that sort, why then there is no claim on their part to be satisfied. The agent can't claim that the fulfillment of those ends on the agent's part has any value. It doesn't enter in. Well, those are some comments about why, or an aspects of why one would characterize the CI procedure and the moral law that it represents and the imperative it represents as categorical, as opposed to the hypothetical imperatives. Any offhand questions about that? Yes?
Could you maybe elaborate on that reasonable rational definition? That is the rational just rational from the standpoint of the actor?
Well, at the moment that I'm thinking of it, yes. But I might say if the distinction between reasonable and irrational isn't clear, if it doesn't help and have a natural sense, then I think maybe for our purposes the best thing to do is to forget about it. That is, it's just briefer terms to deal with from our standpoint, the categorical and the hypothetical imperatives. So while we might go into that, I prefer to it is a good question. It ought to be explained. If it isn't helpful immediately, why let's forget it. I mean, I don't blame you for being puzzled with this, but yeah. Well, what I am suggesting then is if we look at the categorical imperative procedure, how it goes, and so on, then we see this sense in which it's categorical. And I want to make just one other comment about it, and then I think I ought to get on to the idea of the original contract as an idea of reason. It's Kant's thought that what he calls reason in the first critique, as opposed to understanding in the first critique, or Vernunft as opposed to Verstand, that it's only reason that is free. The Verstand, although it has its own categories, to a lot of you this will not make any sense, but it doesn't matter. I won't be very long on this. I just want to explain a certain sort of contrast. But although the Verstand or understanding has its own categories that it applies to objects given in sensible experience, and although it operates that way through concepts, and it is not, as Hume thought of it, governed by natural laws, in particular natural laws of association. In that sense, you might say the understanding is spontaneous. It applies its own concepts to objects in experience. It is not, however, in Kant's view, free. And it's only the Vernunft, which he talks about it in dialectic, of the first critique that's free. And that's why it's always an enormous mistake for people to concentrate on the analytic, thinking they're understanding the main part of the first critique. That's at best but half of the book. Now, the reason is this, is that Kant thinks that the understanding has to be guided. It is unable to set its own ends. And it doesn't have any sense of direction of any kind. And those are provided by ideas of reason. And reason directs the understanding to, and it provides it with certain fundamental ideas of how to classify things. It even, as Kant says in the appendix of transcendental dialectic, it provides it with certain notions to construct its theories with, namely, the example he gives is the basic elements, water, earth, and fire, and so on, of the Greek theory as an example. So in aggregate, you might say that ideas like atoms and so forth and so on are ideas of reason. Those kinds of ideas are provided by reason and go beyond the understanding. So various conservation principles classification, and so forth come from reason. And the most basic idea perhaps of information is the idea of systematic unity of all of our knowledge of nature. So it's the guide for the understanding, and therefore without reason there would be no science, there would be no cosmology, there would be no religion, there would be no general views of society. Because in order to develop conceptions of that sort, we have to have certain general principles and ideas that are, on Kant's view, that issue from reason and not from the understanding. Well, there's a parallel with, in a sense, the system of desires and the rational in the practical sphere. That insofar as we are, in Kant's view, only rational, there's only act from the hypothetical imperative, we do not set ends for ourselves. So it's pure practical reason as opposed to empirical practical reason or the hypothetical imperative. It's only that it's only our capacity to act from that is the moral law, and pure practical reason that enables us to set our own ends and therefore to be free in Kant's sense of that, which I won't go into. So in calling the idea of the original contract an idea of reason, you should be aware of the very special Kantian sense of reason. It's not just Hume's or Leibniz's or any old philosopher's reason. It's this very special sense. When I say it's a special sense, you have to glean what it is from Kant's doctrine as a whole. I've tried to get some flavor of the notion. That's why I make these remarks that to a lot of you, I'm sure, are very mysterious. At least they ought to be, because to anybody they perhaps remain mysterious, but not so much as they are at the very beginning. But you have to realize a very deep sense for Kant of what's meant by saying that the idea of an original concept, an idea of reason. Now, an important element in this is that reason is normative with respect to understanding, and it's in these categories. It's also normative with respect to our natural desires. It has its own norms and principles that it imposes on them. And also, reason has its own interest. Reason is interested. And one way in which we must put this, we could give two illustrations. One would be from the pleasure, you might say, that we take in developing conceptions of cosmology and theories in science, etc., for their own sake. I'm not now thinking of science as an instrumental thing that we ought to know about in order to, say, build houses and so forth, and much less engage in wars, kind that you don't have to describe. But we're not thinking of pure reasons, just that enjoyment of the exercise of constructing of these things, or the pure example, as used to be, would be cosmology. And that illustrates and exemplifies our interest of reason, an interest that we have, and there's an interest of reason. And the same will be so in the case of the moral law, insofar as we have a desire to act from the moral law. Then we can say that we act from an interest of reason, of human reason. So reason has its interest both in the theoretical as well as the practical sphere. And there will be a lot else that one could say about that. Well, let's now turn to the idea of the original contract, an idea of reason, which Asian marks as something in the background. And here, of course, I have to lay aside most, indeed almost all of the details of Kant's doctrine of right, or, as you might also call it, his doctrine of justice, in contrast to his doctrine of virtue. Now, the Metaphysic of Morals falls into two parts. This is the late book, 1797, and one part is a doctrine of right, of justice, and the other is a doctrine of virtue. And the subject of the doctrine of right is the first principles which are to govern, let's say, the system of law and government. Now, the universal principle of right is stated in your text early on in the introductory part to the philosophy of right. It reads as follows. It's in actually C, it's those sections at the beginning. Quote, every action which by itself or by its maxim enables the freedom of each individual's will to coexist with the freedom of everyone else in accordance with a universal law is right. Now, I'll make a few comments on this principle. Within Kant's moral philosophy as a whole, we may think of this principle as a special case of the moral law. Now, I shall not say in any detail how I think Kant makes a connection. Indeed, I'm not sure I understand it entirely, but it doesn't matter. The rough idea is that in the application of the CI procedure, we can distinguish between two different kinds of maxims. One in which the maxim describes the ends or aim from which the agent is motivated to act, or desire for which the agent is motivated to act. And we can call that a maxim of ends. In the other case, there will be maxims that make the agent's end or aims blank, or more or less indeterminate, something like whatever the ends are, and characterizes the agent's means in some, that is, the kind of action that the agent is intending to do. And we could call that a maxim of means. And Kant thinks of the contrast between the first principle of justice and the first principle of doctrine of virtue as the contrast between the duties that develop from a maxim of ends in the case of doctrine of virtue, and from a maxim of means in the doctrine of right. Now, we'll just say that I think plays a part in his view without indicating that that's plausible or one way in which it's the only thing involved there. I think it isn't. But the important thing is that he does think in some way or other that the various duties of justice can be collected under this first principle of right, that principle deals with what it is we do as opposed to our motives for doing it, and that principle itself is related to the moral law. And since the moral law is an idea of reason, all of these ideas, all these notions can be characterized also as ideas of reason. And he often describes them in that way. Now, for Kant, it is an injustice when we are prevented from doing an action which is permissible by a maxim of means, that is a maxim which is authorized by the principle of right. A just system of law is one that allows citizens to do all permissible actions and prevents them from doing only impermissible actions. As Kant says, again, this is in the text, right is therefore the sum total of those conditions within which the will of one person can be reconciled with the will of another in accordance with the universal law of freedom. Now, Kant's distinction between the doctrine of justice. And the doctrine of virtue is, as I indicated a moment ago, interpreted by him to mean that the former deals with what he calls external actions. That is, with what we do and intend to do, and not with our ends or motives in doing those actions. It only deals, he thinks you can make that abstraction. Now, a lot of people have questioned that. But it's supposed to deal with what we do as opposed to our motives. And this is why he says that the universal principle of right does not require us to make that principle itself a maxim of our actions. That is, we are not required to adopt or to have any desire to act from the universal principle of right. That is, the doctrine of right does not require that. What does require that is the doctrine of virtue. That is, it is a virtue. It is a duty that we have as part of the doctrine of virtue to act from and desire to act in accordance with the principle of right. The principle of right itself, however, does not include that, because all it does is to characterize the content, you might say, of a principle of law. It can be incorporated into institutions and enforced by the sovereign. So that the doctrine of justice then is concerned solely with the rightness of the system of law, regarded as regulating what we do. And so long as citizens comply with a system of just law, their conduct is not unjust. Their conduct is not wrong. They may, of course, lack virtue. Their motives may be narrow and even perhaps mean-spirited, but their actions are not wrong, and what they do on constitute will not be said to be unjust. It's in what they do. A just system of public law, on his view, is one thing characterized by the doctrine of right. A virtuous citizenry, count of the virtues, is another thing, and is accounted by the doctrine of virtue. Well, now pass on then to move on to the original contract a bit and work into that. Within the doctrine of right, Kant distinguishes public and private right. Now, private right is ignored in the text. It's about property and other things. So it goes directly from the introduction to public right. And public right, in turn, falls into two parts, that is between the form of regime of a nation state and international law, and I shan't say anything about the latter. Perhaps later on we'll be able to discuss that a bit. Now, Kant discusses the original contract in connection with public right, that is, with the constitution and form of regime of a nation's law and government. So let's note now how I'm making some points about how the original contract, or the idea of that, leads to a view rather different in Kant's hands than it does in the case of Locke. Now I begin first with the way in which the original contract as an idea of reason rules out its being regarded in any way as historical. I'll begin with that. Now we saw that in Locke's case that the doctrine of social contract has two parts. And the first part, you recall, we stated hypothetically, that is the legitimate form of political authority is one that could have been contracted into, or could be contracted into by rightly conducted historical process change and so forth and so on, beginning from a state of equal right at a state of equal contradiction. And that part of it we could state hypothetically. And also the second part of it is requires some kind of actual or joining a consent. Now, Kant's doctrine of the original contract, I think is, well, it's altogether different. I'd say it's something of an exaggeration, but let's say it's altogether different. It dispenses with the thought that the original contract as something which even might have taken place. We saw in the case of Locke that it has to be interpreted hypothetically, because, as we mentioned, the case of something like the Norman Conquest, on the presupposition that after that the time came when the English Constitution did achieve a legitimate form. The explanation of what form is, and on Locke's view, would be, well, it's a form that could be contracted into, and we surveyed that as to why we had to hold that and how that achieved Locke's aims. But in Kant's view, even the notion that it might have taken place in some way is not what's important. And he just then dispenses with that idea. So it has no place for Marx's conception of a rightly conducted historical process of change. Kant uses the idea, I think, of the original contract in a different way. That is, it is a way of conceiving how the state is rightly or justly constituted into a unity, and is also used as a criterion of fundamental law. In other words, the problem is how can we conceive of the state as rightly constituted social unity in which certain forms of power are exercised by the sovereign. So it isn't, I think, enough to distinguish Kant's view from Locke's to say that Kant's view is hypothetical, because Marx's view is also in some sense hypothetical. What we have to do is to notice the difference in the role that the idea of the original contract has in Kant's view, how it connects up with the moral laws and idea of reason, what it means for something to be an idea of reason, and keep in mind, of course, all the time that the moral law is an idea of autonomy, an idea of freedom, and everything involved in that. Now, with this in mind, then, recall that the realm of ends is a moral community. Is it sound now?
Yep.
Cut
Cut
out.
off.
It's cut off.
It's off? I thought it was beginning to sound. Well, the lights on. Is that any better? No, it's dead. Suddenly things again sound different. Well, I don't know the explanation. I guess I will do what I did the other day. I guess. So I'll try to talk a little louder. I guess I'm going to register a complaint. Since we don't here have to deal with Frederick the Great, maybe we can do. Well, with this in mind, recall that the realm of ends, okay, which Kant talks about in the groundwork, is a moral community in which everyone acts from the moral law, or applies the SCI procedure, whatever you want to say, and they act from it as if by a law of nature, but of course not actually as by a law of nature, but it's as if they did in the sense that that's the regularity in their behavior. So that would be a realm of ends, and it's the object of the moral law. That is, it's the kind of society that, if we think through in Kant's terms what the moral law requires of us, that's the kind of society to which it leads. That this kind of a society is not some already given a conception, because somehow we see to be valuable, or to exemplify certain given values. On Kant's view, that would make it prior to the moral law. Rather, it's the other way around. We begin with the moral law and we construct through the CI procedure these various maxims. And then we imagine everybody acting on those maxims as if by a law of nature, and that gives us this object. In that sense, the moral law constructs its own object. That's the language I use. And you might notice, it's very interesting, beginning of the introduction, Kant makes this analogy of how we construct the idea of coexistence of our liberty or our freedom. And he compares that to the construction of concepts the construction of geometric concepts in spatial intuition. It is one of the places in the critique where, in Kant's thought, where the notion of construction is used in connection with moral ideas. That's why it's interesting. He actually does that in this place in connection with right. Well, in any case, the point I want to make then is that when we begin with a state of nature, and Kant thinks that in that state we all have a duty, because this realm of ends has as a necessary precondition the existence of some form of political organization, a state. Therefore, everyone in a state of nature has, in Kant's view, a duty. If you think of the state of nature, again, he describes it as an idea of reason. It's not an actual state. He calls it an idea of reason. We don't have a duty to leave it. Why? Because this realm of ends, which is the object of the moral law, cannot exist, can never be approximated to, unless it has as a background some kind of political organization. And that means, in Kant's view, that we have a duty to enter the state. Then the question is, how or in what way are we to conceive how the state is to be rightly constituted into a unity? How can we conceive of that? Am I talking it too loud or not loud enough? Now recall that in the groundwork, chapter 2, there are 3 formulations of the categorical imperative. Okay? First is the form of the universal law, which Kant calls a strict method, in paragraphs near the end. I think around 72 to 75, where he's giving a summary of the formula. That's a strict method. Then there's a formula of humanity, so-called. And humanity for Kant, you must, not always, but I think almost always, humanity means us in virtue of our moral powers, our powers of pure practical reason and moral sensibility. Now, if our humanity is our capacity to act from the moral law and our capacity to have moral feelings of an appropriate kind in connection with the moral law. That's what makes us human beings in Kant's sense. If we lack that with both of those capacities, why then we would just be purely rational. While we might be very clever and we could do and understand all kinds of things, we would not be human. So that reasoned formulation is called humanity because it protects those particular moral powers, but I'll have to pass over that, or at least that's my guess as to why. So our being ends in ourselves means we have those powers and we have to develop those powers. The third formulation of the categorical imperative is a form of autonomy. And when we look at the moral law that way, we are to look at ourselves as enacting, legislating, through our reason, the public moral principles and rules of this moral community that Kant calls the realm of ends. If we can do that, if we are able to do that, and regard ourselves as enacting those principles and precepts of our reason, then we are fulfilling the form of autonomy. And all of these three ways, just three ways of looking at the CI procedure from different angles. It doesn't alter the content or the precepts that actually pass. So, with this background then understood, we can say that the idea of the original contract is the idea of all citizens as members of the political community acting as full legislative members and willing the fundamental constitutional principles which establish the powers of the political regime, and those same principles will constitute the state into a unity. So, in short, I think the idea of the original contract is Kant's way of regarding the state as founded upon the autonomy of its citizens as free and equal persons with the powers of reason and moral sensibility. It's his way of doing that. And so when he calls it an idea of reason, I think he has all these sorts of thoughts in the background. Now, then what is radically different than in Kant's view, I want to emphasize, isn't really the idea that the contract is non-historical and hypothetical. We just put it that way, although not inaccurate, we would miss the flavor of what's going on. Well, the flavor's not right. I mean, the real sense of what's going on. The sense of what's going on is the original contract is his way of conceiving how the autonomy of the citizen body is reflected and needs to the basic principles of the state, which he thinks in a pure form is going to be a pure republic, it's going to be the constitutional regime, and in the end Kant hopes that the international society will be a society of nations, all of which are such regimes, and he believes that nations of that kind would not go to war, and therefore would be an international society of peace. He doesn't believe in world government because he thinks it would be either a tyranny or divided a civil war. He thinks the only hope for the future is constitutional regimes, a society of such, and he thinks that if that were to come about, it would be peaceful. Well, all of those things are discussed in the essay Perpetual Peace. Well, I won't go on to that. I will just mention it. There are a lot of other things I should say, but I ought to stop. Maybe I should mention something at some point. There's a great discrepancy between what I have just said and Kant's view about revolution. It's very, and when I mentioned the other day about there's some things about Kant's view I don't understand. That's in part what I had in mind. But I will talk about that now. It's Friday and I'm over